Welcome to Chapter 4, Communication Between Cultures, Cultural History, or Antecedents. In Chapter 4, we're going to talk about the second deep structure institution of culture, that of state. When we talk about state, we're discussing the history of the cultural group. That culture's government, community, politics, economics, geography, and the lessons and experiences learned from that particular history. Remember how we said that one of the elements of culture is that it provides us with shared experiences. Many of these experiences come from, or the experiences or these lessons come from our history, our culture's history. When we study the effects of history on culture, we can see it helps us to explain the character of that culture, the values of that culture, the beliefs of that culture. Our failures and successes often shape those things which we consider to be important or that which we consider to be good. We also, when we look to history, we look to see not just what has happened in history, but how our culture has chosen to record that history. What have we chosen out of the events that happened in the past that were important to us? And how do we tell that story? Whether or not we tell that story at all. The stories that we choose to pass down to the next generation and the perspective that we put on what we choose to pass down to the next generation is often a reflection of our cultural values. And often, if we look at these things, we can tell a lot about the character of a particular culture. Okay, so what we're going to do in this chapter is we're going to look at a sampling of several different cultures and just take a look at how certain events or behaviors in their history are a reflection of or even a cause of some of their modern and traditional values and behaviors. We're going to start with the United States. Now, throughout this presentation, the way you're going to see the information categorized or the information organized on the screen is that on the left, you're going to see certain historical events or behaviors, and on the right, you're going to see their cultural results or their cultural manifestations. So let's start with the United States. In the United States, in the early years of the United States, our settlers were individuals who were looking to escape from government oppression by their European governments. Now, the personalities of these people were such that, first of all, they are people who are in a particular situation, a particular homeland, and they are attempting to deviate from the norm of their homeland and therefore suffering some kind of oppression because as a result of that deviation. So the personalities of our settlers are already showing us that they are deviants, that they are individualists, that they want to go against the norm. They are people who are going to assert themselves and people who have a strong sense of individualism and a strong sense of self, strong enough to allow them to deviate or attempt to deviate from the norms, the social norms of their current societies. So, even though the settlers came from a lot of different places and had a lot of different backgrounds, they shared, because of this shared experience, even if it wasn't exactly the same experience, it was similar experiences that they had shared. They all harbored a desire for freedom from government oppression, which led to values such as freedom, responsibility, and equality, which are at the core of our laws, our expressions, and our what we consider to be rights, human rights in our country today. The American settlers came from a variety of different backgrounds, a variety of different countries and cultures and religions and languages. So we have had a situation in this country where we have been a very multicultural, multilingual country from the very, very beginning of our existence. even though the early settlers came from very different backgrounds and were very different people from each other, because they were put in a situation where they were trying to develop a newly relatively undeveloped land, they had to find new ways of living in an environment that they had never been in before. And in order to do that and to survive, they had to work together. So the United States essentially came together to become what is sometimes called the first multicultural nation in the world, because we had people from many, many different backgrounds, many different religions, all having to work together in order just to survive. Because of this early experience and the fact that we have experienced the same situation from our beginning, Americans are relatively accustomed to social diversity. Also, we, even though you can certainly point to times in our past where we have not seemed to be very tolerant of racial or ethnic or religious diversity, generally speaking, we as Americans tend to be more open to cultural change and more tolerant of religions than many other types of older nations, more established nations might be. Many societies that are older than the United States tend to be more formal societies than we are. We are a very informal society. This also comes from our early experiences. When the settlers came here, they, again, as we said before, had to adopt an entirely new way of living, an entirely new way of survival. And settling this new undeveloped land required a lot of time, a lot of attention, and the settlers really didn't have the time or the patience to deal with the formalities of government or the formalities of society that they had been accustomed to in their past. So they developed a new way of interacting with each other, which was much more formal, saved a lot more time, much more direct. In addition, even though we said they had to band together just a few minutes ago, we said they had to band together in order to form the first multicultural nation in the world, just to make sure that they survived, they also kept a little bit of a reservation when it came to their independency. Remember, they came from situations where they were trying to assert themselves, trying to deviate from the social norms, trying to deviate from a great central government. So now they're becoming much more informal. They are dependent upon each other to an extent, but they're also becoming very individualistic in that, yes, I will work with you, I will depend upon you, and you depend upon me, but I am also going to be looking out for me while you look out for you. So individualism, the concept of individualism, became even more pronounced because of this situation. Anything that might violate your right to think for yourself, to judge for yourself, or make your own decisions began to become morally wrong. And that was a basis, again, for many of the laws that came about when we did finally start having a central government and creating a constitution. The American culture is believed to be a fairly aggressive culture, particularly when it is done in the name of protecting property or proliferating our principles around the world. And if you look to the left of the PowerPoint, we can see three particular historical points that indicate this degree of tolerance for aggression. First of all, we see that war and military deployment is a frequent occurrence in American history. It is not something that we can just point to one or two particular military experiences. We really have had a frequent military presence or a frequent military action throughout our history. Also, we are the only country in the world whose constitution guarantees its citizens to bear arms. So that also indicates a degree of tolerance for aggression. And we have historically been driven by the concept of manifest destiny. This is the spreading of freedom and democracy to justify our military acquisitions and occupations. So we will not only put our military out there on a regular basis, but we do so with this concept that we are encouraging our ideals, we are protecting our ideals, and we are spreading our ideals to the rest of the world, and that this is actually a worthwhile behavior in order to spread our values and beliefs. The United States has always been a culture with a strong love of change and progress. This again comes from our early experiences where we had to essentially create a nation out of a generally undeveloped land. While there are many historical examples to the contrary, we generally have had a great deal of tolerance and actually encouragement for new ideas and new innovations, and our love of progress also encourages us to reward people for accomplishing tasks and coming up with new ideas and new ways of doing things. It's considered to be a very highly desirable attribute in individuals here in the United States. Next week, you will be watching a video on what makes Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh. In that video, they have a rather extensive section on the proud engineering background of Pittsburgh. And this discussion really brings out, not just in the local area, but the value of innovation, the value of change in the overall American culture. Now we're going to take a look at Russia. Russian history is very different from American history. One of the ways in which it is different is that since we have not experienced an occupation since our initial independence, but Russia, on the other hand, throughout their history has suffered a series of invasions and occupations by people from other countries and other nations. And these occupations have not always been pleasant, as occupations tend not to be pleasant. Sometimes they are, but not usually. The Russian natives saw a great deal of devastation, a great deal of suffering at the hands of many of these foreign invaders. And as a result, they have developed a little bit of a distrust of outsiders, of people who are non-Russian. Another difference between the Russian history and the U.S. history is we have had only one type of government since our inception. Russia has historically experienced many different types of governments. Many of these governments have been mostly autocratic, which means governed by a tyrannical and/or undisputed leader. The Russians are actually very accustomed to this type of government and have come to culturally prefer this type of government. They have, for many generations, experienced a very oppressive type of governing system where they are told what they need to do. They are strictly governed and strictly controlled by their very centralized and autocratic governments. Over time, this has instilled the Russians with traits that make it easier for them to live in this type of environment. They are more easily accepting of the dictation of their leaders. They are also able to endure hardship as the result of the dictations of these leaders. But at the same time, they've also come to prefer this type of government. They've gotten used to this type of government. They like the security that it provides. They like the certainty that it provides. Therefore, when democracy was introduced into Russia fairly recently, it didn't work very well, at least not in the form that we are used to. It had to take a more autocratic form in order for it to be accepted into the culture of the Russians. As we said in the previous slide, recent attempts at democracy in Russia have met with a great deal of difficulty. Democracy doesn't really work very well in Russia because they have had so much historical experience with more autocratic governments that their national culture has really been built around those types of governments. So even though they may be able to accept and work with a form of democracy, the democracy as we know it here in the United States is probably not going to work in Russia very long term. They have to come up with their own cultural type or form of democracy if democracy is going to work in Russia. The Russians have made incredible contributions to the world of performing and cultural arts. Many of the world's best performers, dancers, compositions, and writers are from Russia. Because of this, Russians are very proud of those contributions. They are generally instilled in their culture and instilled in their education with a great respect for the cultural arts. They take a great deal of pride in their country's accomplishments in this regard. Now we're going to take a look at China. China is the world's oldest continuous civilization. China is physically surrounded and isolated from the rest of the world by mountains, oceans, and deserts. In early times, this was a great barrier to any type of transportation. Therefore, China found itself not very much in contact with the outside world. They found themselves extremely isolated from the ideas of the outside world and only interacted with people from outside of China on a very limited basis. Not only that, China actively sought to isolate itself from the outside world. After having been isolated for so long, they developed a very great pride in their cultural and personal achievements. They began to feel as though their language and politics and art were inherently superior to that of other cultures. And therefore they felt that in order to keep that pure, they would isolate themselves from influences of the outside world. So they kept themselves, not only were they physically isolated by their geographical location, but they were also purposefully trying to isolate themselves from the rest of the world. However, in the 19th century, China was forced to open itself to Western powers. They, did not really have much choice. They weren't able to fight against the Western powers at that time to keep themselves closed. And when China was forced to open its borders, it also began a change in the Chinese culture because of the new interactions with the Western culture. So we saw a lot of changes going on in the culture at that time. Traditional Chinese society was built on agriculture. People who grew up on these farms and engaged in agriculture for their entire lives generally did not move around very much. They pretty much stayed in the same areas in which they were born. So there was very little social mobility, very little geographical mobility. As a result, they developed a very collective culture where one's clan or one's family was essentially their entire world. Any concept of a larger central government or larger cities or things that were going on outside of their communities were more just stories than reality. Therefore, the family became a more important cultural group than that of the state. Chinese culture puts a great deal of emphasis on education. Values of learning are a big part of their culture, and Chinese children are generally pushed very hard by their parents to excel in their studies. This is a common Asian trait, but one that is very strong in China particularly. And you can see that in their historical development. China has had a very long history of education, a long history of putting a great deal of emphasis on education. In fact, civil service examinations were instituted in antiquity there. they continued that practice until the 1900s. These exams allowed people of education to advance socially, even regardless of the influence of their family or their political connections. This was almost unheard of in the ancient world. You were more or less born into the society that you would stay into. Moving from one level of society to another was very, very uncommon. But having these types of civil service exams allowed people of even meager means to be able to become educated, to be able to raise the honor and social status of that person and that person's entire family. We Americans tend to think of ourselves as the only multicultural nation in the world, but that's not necessarily really so. Take a look at India. India is a land of great diversity. Within India, there are over 2,000 ethnic groups and 18 official languages, a lot more languages. They have a lot more languages that are not official. And they include religions such as Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, Sikhism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Parsi, just to name a few. So we can see that Indians are very well accustomed to working with social and religious diversity, particularly religious diversity. Religious tolerance is a very principal value of their particular culture. Now, I know you're going to say there is a lot of difficulties in India between Muslims and Hindus, but that has a lot to do more with history than with religion, as we're going to see. India has experienced, like Russia, a series of occupations and invaders from other countries and other lands. And they have often, like Russia, not always had good experiences with these invasions. Historically, they have had a lot of invaders that were Muslim and also the British, and because they were mistreated by these particular groups, those historical mistreatments have strained their relations between these particular cultures, the Muslim culture and the British culture. Now, not all of the invasions were bad. They did have Muslim invasions, the Muslim Mongols, that were quite peaceful and very prosperous for the country, actually, and are looked back at well among Indians as part of their cultural history. However, that peaceful and prosperous reign of the Mongols was not successful in smoothing out some of the historical hatreds of Muslims in general that was caused by the mistreatment of the original Muslim invaders. As a result, Muslims and Hindus have a long history of division within India. Their divisions, however, are primarily based upon these historical hatreds and not really upon religion, but upon just bad feelings between two particular groups, more political, more historical issues, rather than a clash of religious values. India has experienced recently, in recent years, a great economic growth, a lot of prosperity, and as a result of that economic growth, we see a lot of Indian people going to become educated in other countries and bringing that education back to India. As a result, they have created a class of very highly educated and very wealthy people in India. But even with this growing wealthy class, this growing upper class, we still see a lot of the population, about over half of the population, continuing to be very poor, continuing to live in rural villages, and about 40% of the population still remain to be illiterate. Because of this, we have an interesting situation where in India, even though we have a lot of cultural change, a lot of economic growth, a lot of prosperity, among many of the occupants of India, traditional values remain fairly unchanged. Life remains fairly unchanged, and therefore our traditional Indian values stay fairly strong, even in the face of all this modernization, in the face of this economic change. Among those traditions is the importance of family. Family is the most important social institution, and over government, over organizational loyalties, family is the most important. We also see a great respect for hierarchy and a great respect for authority, not just in the family but outside of the family as well. Now let's take a few minutes to look at some of Japan's cultural history. Historically, Japan has received most of its influence from its closest neighbors, China and Korea. In fact, its most formal form of writing, kanji, are actually Chinese characters. They also have received influences of Confucianism and Buddhism from these countries. Just like China, they have been geographically isolated for many, many years because they are an island nation. And also they, just like China, strove to politically isolate themselves as well. As a result, they had very low numbers of immigrants historically. And this isolation has added to a very strong sense of self-identity, a very homogenous culture in that everyone pretty much understands everybody else. It is a very collective culture. They tend to be self-conscious in the presence of people who are non-Japanese. One thing, their culture has given them a lot of preparation in how to interact with one another. There are a lot of very strict protocols, strict social rules in how to interact with one another, but their culture never had the need to prepare them in how to react to people who were non-Japanese. There is no established correct way of interacting with foreigners. If you recall, when we talked about acculturation in Chapter 2, we were talking about how when you are moving into it, or you are acculturating to a new environment, we often find that the people around us seem to be a little bit standoffish or seem to be a little bit uncertain of how to interact with us. Remember that we said that as we go through acculturation in a situation like that, the people around us, the natives of the new environment that we're going into, are also going through an acculturation period where they have to learn about us. They have to adjust to us and our way of doing things, even though while we are adjusting to them at the same time. In the Japanese situation, this is particularly noticeable because they have had no experience with dealing with outsiders. Now this is changing as time goes on and as the Japanese are getting used to having more foreigners around, and with the internet and everything, they have more exposure to other ideas, more exposure to Western ways of doing things, and more knowledge about us, generally speaking, more readily available knowledge about us. So they are able to prepare themselves and come up with ways of dealing with foreigners in ways that they did not have the ability to do in the past. But you will often find a little bit of this going on whenever you leave the major cities, going into any rural areas or villages. You may appear as though they don't trust you, or as though you are unwelcome as a foreigner, but that's really not true. It's just that they really just don't know how to interact, so they tend to avoid that kind of interaction. In the 1600s, Japan was unified under a central government. This central government established a system of strict behavioral norms in an effort to force societal stability. This is based upon the concepts of Confucianism that we'll discuss in Chapter 5. In Japan, as a result, there is a correct, almost ritualistic way of doing just about everything, even small tasks such as eating, getting dressed, even thinking. And because it is such a homogeneous and collective culture, deviant behavior is very negatively received. They find that their social stability is based upon everybody doing pretty much the same thing at pretty much the same time and in pretty much the same way, making it one of the most collective and homogeneous cultures in the world. They also tend to be very resistant to change and have a very large aversion to any kind of risk, because they see their social stability as being dependent upon these ritualistic ways of doing things. Early Japanese government created a situation where citizens were dependent upon the protection of feudal lords. It was a very feudal country, and Japanese citizens would pledge their loyalty and their services to the feudal lords in exchange for protection, in exchange for work, and in exchange for food or whatever they needed to survive. Today, we see the same type of thing. It's no longer the government is no longer a feudal system, but we see the same type of concept being carried out in modern corporations. Modern corporations and the government have replaced the feudal lords and often offer a lifetime employment to their employees, who will, as they did in the past, offer their loyalty and their services in exchange for this long-term employment, for this protection and this continuity. Also, Japan had a largely mountainous topography. Because of that topography, and because the early demands of a more agricultural type of society made group cooperation very, very necessary, particularly if you have a lot of rice fields. That requires a lot of work, a lot of people working together to make that happen. So as a result, they became a very collective society. And today, Japan still remains as one of the most collective cultures in the world. One's status is based more upon their group membership than upon their individual achievements. Exclusion was and still is a very severe form of social punishment. Japan has a very different attitude toward military activity than does the United States. And this is due mainly to its historical experiences. Japan sought to isolate itself for many centuries from the influences of the outside world, but it was unable to resist its modernization. It was unable to resist the Western forces and the Western influences, ultimately in the 1800s, and this eventually led to its involvement in World War II, and therefore its near destruction with the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As a result of that very negative experience with its involvement with the outside world, and with particularly military involvement in the affairs of the outside world, because of that, Japan has adopted a very pacifist attitude toward military engagement. They are very reluctant to engage in military actions unless it is directly related to its national self-defense. Now we're going to take a look at Mexico. To look at Mexican culture is to take a look back into history quite a ways, to the pre-Columbian period. The pre-Columbian period of history in Mexico saw a lot of achievements, a lot of very great achievements in science, agriculture, and the arts. And Mexicans are very proud of this heritage. Much of the preserved architecture that you will see when you go to visit Mexico is from the pre-Columbian period. Much of their art, their food, their stories, their music are derived from this particular period of time and are very important to the Mexican national identity. Following the pre-Columbian period, Mexico was violently invaded and conquered by the Spanish. It was, like I said, a very violent invasion, and the native Mexicans were very heavily subjugated, and in some cases completely eliminated, complete populations and complete cultures. The influence of the Spanish culture changed Mexico forever. They introduced the idea of Catholicism, which is now the most important or the most common religion in Mexico. And they developed a very rigid social class system. Many of the rather large tracts of land that were won by the invaders were given over to Spanish conquerors, and the Spanish conquerors acted almost like as feudal lords to the remaining native Mexican populations. And this created a very large gap between the upper and the lower classes. These gaps remain today. Despite attempts at equalization and attempts at democracy, the Mexican social structure still reflects a lot of what was developed at the time of the Spanish invasion. There are large discrepancies in the social classes. There is a lot of emphasis placed on hierarchy in the Mexican government, and a lot of emphasis placed on social differences. The Mexican-American War, in which Mexico lost a great deal of land to the United States, created a great deal of bitterness and hostility in Mexico toward the United States, and vice versa. Latin American relationships with the United States are often marred by a lot of suspicion or a lot of distrust of each other. And this can be seen in a lot of the both historical and modern issues surrounding illegal immigration from Mexico to the United States. Mexicans tend to view immigration to the United States, legal or illegal, as simply a natural response to the economic demands. If I can't get a job here in Mexico, why shouldn't I go to the United States where there are jobs? However, Americans view the illegal immigration or illegal immigration of Mexicans into the United States as eroding law, as threatening our jobs and our stability, and diluting the United States job market. So there's a big, even though the Mexican-American War was a long time ago, we still have a lot of bad feelings. We still have a lot of residual hostility between the two countries. Now we're going to take a look at the history of Islamic civilization. The first thing we're going to talk about is related to the religion itself. Much of the religion that we see today, not just the religion, but the culture surrounding that religion that we see today, was influenced very heavily by a particular event in history. When the Prophet Muhammad died, there was no evident successor, so they chose to appoint 4 persons to succeed him as the leaders of the religion. These caliphs instituted a lot of new rules and values that were sometimes in opposition to the teachings of the Quran and of the Prophet himself. But because many of the people of that time were uneducated and illiterate, they were not able to speak up and say that this is wrong, you are wrong what you are doing, you are not interpreting things correctly. And those that did, were not happy with the changes that the caliphs were making and did try to stand up to them, were very violently and very completely subdued. Many of the changes that the caliphs attempted to bring in were more of a reflection of pre-Islamic Arabic culture rather than of the teachings of the Prophet or the teachings of Islam itself. So a lot of what we see in Arabic culture today and other Islamic-derived civilizations is actually not the result of the teachings of the Prophet or of the Quran, but of pre-Islamic Arabic culture as a result of the workings of the caliphs. The two main sects of Islam actually stem from a historical disagreement at the time of the Prophet's death as to who should succeed him. As I mentioned before, ultimately there were 4 caliphs who were chosen to succeed the Prophet, but not all of the Muslims at the time agreed that that was the proper way to go. Many of them believed that the succession of the Prophet should fall along his biological line. So the leadership, they felt that the leadership of the religion should go from the Prophet to one of his sons to one of his sons, the same way that a monarchy would do. Division or disagreement between this actually is what is at the basis of the split between the two Muslim, or the split between the Muslims at the time, creating both the Sunni and the Shiite sects. So if we look at this, we realize that Sunni and Shiite Muslims actually, at their core, at their basis, do not share differences in their basic culture and their basic values. Any differences in culture are probably due more to non-Arabic influences that we see, where most Shiite Muslims are actually in non-Arab based countries, as opposed to the Sunni Muslims, which are more common in Arab based countries. So, when we talk about their basic Islamic values and their Islamic culture, they are pretty much the same. As previously alluded to, many Islamic cultures are not Arab cultures. Many Islam spread throughout the world and is common across the globe, and not just in the Arab cultural areas. So the growth of Islam into non-Arab communities changed the Arab-dominated religion into what we would consider now a multi-ethnic theocracy. And that affects the way people view the religion and the way that people practice their religion. In Islam, Muslims of all backgrounds, not just Arab backgrounds, are considered to be equal. There's no distinction between one or the other, that one is better than the other. However, historically, many non-Arabs tend to view Arabs as being authorities on the religion of Islam, simply because they speak Arabic and the Quran is originally written in Arabic, and therefore they feel that these people must be authorities on the religion simply because they speak the language of the Quran. Education diminishes this concept. The more educated a particular non-Arab group of Muslims tend to be, then the less they're going to follow this ideology or this concept that many Arabs have some authority on religion. Islam expanded largely through occupation, historically speaking. But most Muslim occupations have been relatively, if compared to other types of occupations, relatively tolerant and free of religious persecution. Muslims are actually very tolerant of other cultures and other religions. Christians and Jews particularly are considered to be people of the book. And we will talk about this more when we talk about Islam in Chapter 5. So these religions are respected and considered to be very compatible to Islam. The problems that we see today and the differences and the prejudices that we see today between these two groups of people are based more on cultural intolerance and misunderstandings, as well as historical and political disputes, than really upon religious problems or difficulties with religious ideologies. The defeat of the largest and longest Muslim empire was the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War, concluded more than 13 centuries of a politically unified Islam. It broke it up into several different nation states, which were then dominated by Western colonial masters until after the Second World War. As a result, since this happened, the Muslim world has been dominated by its interaction with the West and Western colonial masters, and has been subject to constant and not always voluntary cultural change. The resulting reaction to this has been, in many cases, a call from religious leaders to return to what they consider to be strict Islamic principles and culture that existed prior to the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, and along with it, hopefully, a return to the unification and the return to the glory days of the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so we saw several different examples of how history is a reflection of and a cause of particular modern ideologies, modern values, modern behaviors. And, there are many more examples than the ones that we have provided, but this is just a sampling to get you to understand the effect that history has on both traditional culture and modern culture. So at this point, we want you to make sure you've read Chapter 4 on your own, but also listen, or if you want to, create a multiple choice exam question as assigned here on this slide, and get it to me by the date of your exam on Chapter 4.